At 7:50 a.m. local time on Sunday, the 7th of December, 1941, Japanese aircraft attacked American bases on the Pacific island of Hawaii. President Franklin Roosevelt's reaction was decisive.
I ask that the Congress declare that since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
Ever since Japanese troops had overrun Manchuria in 1931 and turned it into the puppet state of Manchu Kuo, there had been concern in the West over Japanese expansionism. This had increased in 1937, when the Japanese launched an all-out assault on China. But the Western powers were not prepared to risk war with Japan. This was even though Western warships like the American gunboat Panay were bombed by Japanese aircraft. Yet Japan did apologize for this act. She did so because she had a major weakness, which the West threatened to exploit. This was a grave lack of natural resources. Japan was heavily reliant on imports of tin, oil, rubber, and other essential raw materials. She therefore dare not provoke the West too much. In the meantime, the Chinese struggle against Japan did have Western moral support. Their leader, Chiang Kai-shek, also began to receive American loans to enable him to purchase modern weapons and equipment. These were delivered via a road that had been recently opened through the mountains separating Burma from China. It became known as the Burma Road. In July 1940, a new and more militant government took over in Japan. This looked to making the country economically independent of the West by carving out an empire in Southeast Asia through removing the British, French, Dutch, and American presence from the mineral-rich territories there. This plan was called the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. In order to counterbalance British and American opposition to her policies, Japan signed a tripartite pact with Germany and Italy in September 1940. Later, in April 1941, the Japanese removed the Russian threat to the north by signing a 5-year non-aggression pact in Moscow. The Japanese now turned south to French Indochina, demanding and gaining military bases in the north from a weak Vichy government. A clash between the French and neighboring Thailand in early 1941 enabled the Japanese to act as mediators, thereby increasing their influence. The French were now powerless to resist further demands, and in July 1941, the Japanese occupied the whole of French Indochina. The reaction of the Western democracies was to freeze all Japanese assets, which cut off 90% of Japanese imports at a stroke. This forced the Japanese to adopt a more conciliatory attitude, especially towards the Americans. In the meantime, the fighting in China dragged on. Chiang Kai-shek, however, received a boost when the Lend-Lease Act was introduced in America in March 1941, giving him priority next below Britain for the receipt of US munitions. One of the subsequent results of this was the dispatch to China of 100 P-40 fighters, with volunteer pilots to fly them. Led by former US Army aviator Claire Chennault, who had been helping to train the Chinese Air Force, they began to make an impression in the skies over China from the late summer of 1941 and became known as the Flying Tigers. Japanese Premier Prince Fumimaro Konoye hoped that he could achieve an understanding with the United States. But American insistence on total Japanese evacuation from China was an obstacle that could not be surmounted. Consequently, in October 1941, Prince Konoye resigned and was succeeded by General Hideki Tojo, a leading hawk. He was determined that Japan must become self-sufficient in raw materials. He was prepared to withdraw from Indochina and parts of China, but only if the United States lifted its trade embargo and helped Japan acquire the oil, coal, and rubber-rich Dutch East Indies. This was unacceptable to the Americans, who again demanded that Japan withdraw totally from China. By now, though, Tojo had decided that war was probably the only answer. Plans for it had already been laid, and Japan was poised to take a path which had earlier been spelt out by the Chinese ambassador to the United States.
Let us hope that this threat of a complete economic blockade may be sufficient to bring Japan to her senses before she plunges further in the direction of a national harakiri or national suicide.
The architect of the Japanese attack plan was Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Navy. He recognized that America's overwhelming material strength would be the deciding factor in a protracted war. Consequently, the Japanese must quickly gain all their objectives. Yamamoto considered the U.S. Pacific Fleet as the main obstacle. It must therefore be destroyed at the outset. The question was how. The clue, he believed, lay in the highly successful British carrier-borne aircraft attack on the Italian fleet at Taranto in November 1940. If the Japanese carrier force could get within range of the Pacific Fleet base at Pearl Harbor without being detected, it could launch a similar strike. This is what the Japanese Navy began to train for. The attack on Pearl Harbor was to be accompanied by others on the American Pacific islands of Wake and Guam, the British colony of Hong Kong, the Philippines, Malaya, Dutch East Indies, Solomon Islands, and Burma. The Americans believed that the Philippines were likely to be the main Japanese target. Consequently, with the agreement of the Filipino government, former U.S. Army Chief of Staff Douglas MacArthur, who had recently been advisor to the Filipino Armed Forces, was appointed to command the defense of the Philippines. U.S. aircraft were also sent there. The British, too, had reinforced their small garrison in Hong Kong. They sent Indian and Canadian troops. But should Japanese forces cross into Hong Kong from China, the colony's remoteness precluded additional speedy reinforcement. Further troops, including Australians, had been sent to Malaya. Air reinforcement included these Lend-Lease Brewster Buffalo fighters. 2 British capital ships were ordered to Singapore, the Prince of Wales and the Repulse. Yet among both Americans and British, there was a dangerous complacency born of an underestimation of Japanese military prowess. They considered that Japanese weaponry was inferior and that their pilots, in particular, lacked skill. A large espionage network was another Japanese strength. A further factor ignored by the West was the Banzai culture with which Japanese soldiers, sailors, and airmen were imbued. The highest honor that they could gain was to be killed in battle for the emperor. Surrender was considered a disgrace. On the 26th of November 1941, the Japanese fleet, including 6 carriers, set sail for Pearl Harbor. This was on the same day that America issued her latest demand for Japanese withdrawal from China. The fleet sailed under strict radio silence, which meant that while the Americans knew that it was at sea, they had no idea of its destination. As the ships steamed ever closer to their target, the Japanese envoys in Washington continued to negotiate. The American Pacific Fleet spent the first week of December 1941 on maneuvers. The ships returned to Pearl Harbor for the weekend, however. But the 2 fleet carriers, Lexington and Enterprise, were away, bound for Wake and Midway. Aboard the Japanese carriers, the air crews received their final briefings and climbed into their aircraft. At 6:15 on the morning of that Sunday, the 7th of December, they began to take off for their target, which lay 200 miles to the south. On Hawaii, a radar operator picked up approaching aircraft on his screen, but no one believed that they were hostile, and the Japanese flew on. At 7:50 a.m., 214 Japanese aircraft appeared over Hawaii. Bombers struck at the 4 airfields on the island, destroying a large number of American aircraft. A desperate American radio operator transmitted the message, "Air raid Pearl Harbor. This is no drill." The attack was a total surprise, and no American aircraft got airborne. Torpedo bombers made for Battleship Row, where the serried ranks of warships were as sitting ducks. An hour later, a second wave of Japanese aircraft flew into the attack. This time, the American air defenses were a little better prepared, but even so, further ships were hit. By 10 o'clock, it was all over. The heart had been torn out of the Pacific Fleet. Over 2,000 Americans had been killed and many more wounded. "18 vessels, including 6 battleships, had been sunk or badly damaged. "350 American aircraft had been destroyed or damaged, while the Japanese lost just 29 aircraft and 5 midget submarines. It was a devastating blow. Elsewhere, Japanese aircraft bombed Wake, Guam, and the Philippines. while destroyers bombarded Midway Island. But a change in the weather meant that some Japanese aircraft were unable to land back on their carriers. The Japanese also realized that they had missed the 2 American carriers, an omission which they would have cause to regret. Next day, President Roosevelt drove to Congress to call for an immediate declaration of war on Japan. Roosevelt himself had heard the news of Pearl Harbor while at lunch, Washington being 5 hours ahead of Hawaii. He had, as the result of a decoding of a long message sent by Tokyo to its ambassador in Washington, during the night, already been made aware that a Japanese attack was imminent. He was, however, astonished, like his military commanders, that the main strike had been against Pearl Harbor and not the Philippines. Thus, after more than 15 months of agonizing, the United States now found herself plunged into war, but at least she was better organized for it than she had been in 1917. Roosevelt's declaration of war immediately made the American people forget their differences over whether to enter the conflict or not. Now they came together as one. On America's west coast, measures were taken to counter an immediate Japanese invasion. Another immediate step was to round up all Japanese Americans, some 100,000 in all, and intern them. In the Pacific, Guam fell on the 10th of December, after unopposed Japanese landings in the Gilberts the previous day. The American garrison on Wake Island repulsed the initial Japanese attempt to land, but was eventually forced to surrender on the 23rd of December. Hong Kong, like the Pacific Islands, was too isolated to enable any immediate reinforcement to be sent. The Japanese soon drove the British, Canadian, and Indian defenders out of the new territories on mainland China back across the water to Hong Kong Island itself. The garrison was forced to surrender on Christmas Day, 1941. The Japanese 25th Army, under the redoubtable General Tomoyuki Yamashita, was soon making progress in Malaya. He was helped by 2 significant factors. For many years, the British had concentrated on the island of Singapore as their main bastion in the Far East, but their defenses assumed that the threat to it was from the sea, rather than down through Malaya to its north. Only belatedly did the British recognize that Malaya too could be attacked and deploy more troops to defend it. These trained, but in the wrong way, being convinced that the Japanese would rely on the few roads running down the peninsula. Training in fighting in the jungle, which made up most of Malaya, was therefore given low priority. Yamashita invaded Malaya from Thailand, and by landing on the northeast coast, his troops were soon thrusting south. The newly arrived Prince of Wales and Repulse had been sent from Singapore to intercept the landings, but they were spotted. Japanese aircraft set off and attacked the 2 ships on the 10th of December. Both were hit and sunk. It was a blow from which the defenders of Malaya and Singapore never really recovered. Many British aircraft were destroyed on the ground early on, and the remainder withdrew to Singapore. This gave the Japanese air supremacy over Malaya, and they badly disrupted British communications. Japanese aircraft also attacked Singapore itself. Meanwhile, Yamashita's troops pressed southwards. Many were to ride the length of Malaya on bicycles. Once they came up against opposition, the Japanese would take to the jungle and outflank the British positions. As a result, British command, control and cohesion began to suffer. The British troops did their best, but constantly found themselves in danger of being cut off and had to make hurried withdrawals. Soon, withdrawal turned to retreat. Pre-war beliefs in Japanese military incompetence were being dispelled the hard way. Eventually, on the 31st of January, the British withdrew across the causeway separating Malaya from Singapore. They prepared the bridge over it for demolition. Once the last troops had crossed over to Singapore, the bridge was destroyed. In the meantime, the British General Archibald Wavell had been appointed Allied commander in the region, the first of many such Allied command and control steps. He had visited Singapore and warned the British government that it could not hold out for long. Churchill, however, was insistent. The British people had been led to believe that Singapore was impregnable. But this did not stop British families from being evacuated by ship. Many would never see husbands and fathers again, while others would be lost at sea. Japanese air and artillery bombardment increased. On the 8th of February 1942, they crossed the causeway and landed on Singapore. The final battle now began. The demoralized defenders, even though they had just received more reinforcements from Britain, could do little to stop the victorious Japanese. On the 15th of February, the British, accepting that further resistance would merely cost needless lives, both military and civilian, surrendered. It was a moment of triumph for Yamashita, but for his opponent, General Percival, one of bitter humiliation, as it was for the British as a whole. No less than 130,000 British and Dominion troops were made prisoner. The focus now switched to the Dutch East Indies. Here the Dutch had reasonably well-equipped forces, but they had no combat experience. Japanese landings had begun in mid-December in North Borneo, Sarawak and the Celebes. They spread to Borneo and Sumatra, and finally, by mid-February, to Java. This Oriental blitzkrieg was, as it had been for the British, too much for the Dutch. Thus the Dutch were forced to concede defeat, and by early March 1942, another plum had fallen into the Japanese lap. Besides attacking British and Dutch possessions in Southeast Asia, the Japanese had also made the Philippines one of their initial targets. The first Japanese landings had been made on the 10th of December, 1941. Because these landings were dispersed, it proved impossible for the overall Allied commander, American General Douglas MacArthur, to prevent the beachheads from being secured. This was because his forces were not strong enough to guard every coastline that made up the Philippine Islands. He therefore initially planned to conduct a fighting withdrawal and wear the Japanese down. MacArthur's problem was aggravated by more Japanese landings on the southern island of Mindanao and on the west coast of Luzon. On the 24th of December, the Japanese made another landing on Luzon, this time on the east coast. This created a multiple threat to Manila, the capital. MacArthur feared that defending the city would cost many civilian lives. The Allied forces therefore withdrew to the Bataan Peninsula west of Manila Bay. The Japanese entered Manila, which had been declared an open city, on the 2nd of January 1942. For 3 months, the American and Filipino troops managed to hold the Japanese forces on the Bataan Peninsula. Both sides became short of food and were ravaged by disease. But the Japanese continued to try and break through. Filipino President Manuel Quezon, seen here visiting Roosevelt before the war, wanted to end the suffering to his country. But Roosevelt was adamant that resistance must continue, although he did arrange for Quezon to be evacuated to Australia. He also ordered MacArthur to Australia in order to set up a new Allied command in the Southwest Pacific. Here MacArthur was greeted as a symbol of American support for Australia. He vowed, however, to return to the Philippines. On the 24th of March, 1942, 2 weeks after MacArthur had left for Australia, the Japanese, now reinforced, launched a bombing offensive on the American and Filipino positions. On the 4th of April, Japanese troops attacked the Allied defenses on Bataan. 5 days later, the Allied forces here surrendered. This left just the island fortress of Corregidor at the entrance to Manila Bay. Japanese troops assaulted this on the 5th of May. Two days later, General Jonathan Wainwright, MacArthur's successor, surrendered. Allied troops falling into Japanese hands were to experience privations that they could have scarcely imagined. Of the 12,000 Americans captured on Bataan, only a third survived the war. Many perished on the infamous Bataan Death March, which they were ordered to make immediately after the surrender on Bataan. Many British and Dominion prisoners were employed as slave labor to build the Burma-Thailand Railway. European civilians who were unable to get away were also interned, including women and children. They too had to endure many hardships. indigenous races also suffered. Another territory to fall to the Japanese was Burma. Air raids on Rangoon, the capital, preceded the invasion. As was the case elsewhere, these raids were designed to lower morale, especially that of the Burmese themselves. The ground offensive was launched in mid-February from Thailand. The weak British, Indian and Burmese forces were soon in retreat, finding it impossible to prevent the Japanese from infiltrating through the jungle. The Japanese entered Rangoon on the 8th of March and then pursued the British northwards. Chinese forces tried to help, but they too were soon forced to retreat. Soon the Japanese had driven the Allies back across the mighty Irrawaddy and Chindwin rivers and back into the northeast Indian province of Assam. This meant that the Burma Road, the one route that the Western Allies could use to keep Chiang Kai-shek supplied, was closed. From now on, all supplies had to be flown over the mountains separating Burma from China. This perilous route was known to the pilots who flew it as the Hump. The spectacular overrunning of Malaya and Burma convinced the British troops that the Japanese were far superior to them in jungle warfare. Morale was not helped by a wave of unrest as Indians agitated for independence from Britain. This kept many troops tied down on internal security duties. A Japanese naval squadron also entered the Indian Ocean in April 1942. It sent aircraft to attack Colombo, capital of Ceylon, now Sri Lanka. The Japanese also made a series of landings in New Guinea and on the Solomon Islands. This brought the war ever closer to Australia. On the 22nd of March 1942, Japanese aircraft attacked Darwin in the north of the country. Such was the concern that this was the precursor to a Japanese invasion that a wholesale evacuation of livestock southwards from northern Australia began to take place. It seemed as though nothing could stop the victorious Japanese from achieving their objective of a large Pacific and Asian empire. But there were gleams of hope for the Allies. On the 18th of April 1942, 16 B-25 bombers led by Colonel James Doolittle took off from the American carrier Hornet, which was 750 miles east of Tokyo. They bombed the Japanese capital and other cities and then flew on to China. The sheer audacity of this operation provided an enormous boost to Allied morale at what was a very dark time in the Pacific. More important was that American codebreakers had identified the next Japanese objective as Port Moresby in Papua. The Japanese mounted their landings from Rabaul. An American task force built round the carriers Lexington and Yorktown, which had escaped destruction at Pearl Harbor, prepared to intercept the invasion fleet in the Coral Sea. On the 7th of May, the two naval forces clashed, but the battle was to take a novel form. Japanese carrier-borne aircraft struck first. they badly damaged an oiler. The Americans then located and flew sorties against the Japanese carrier force and its escorts. They managed to sink the carrier Shoho. The Japanese failed to locate the American carriers, and they decided to postpone the landing operation for 2 days. Not all American aircraft, however, landed back intact. Next morning, there were further strikes against each side's carriers. The Japanese Shokaku was crippled, but the Americans also lost Lexington to torpedo bomber attack and withdrew. Nonetheless, the Battle of the Coral Sea had for the first time frustrated Japanese plans. But they had drawn up another plan for landings in the Aleutian Islands and for an attack on Midway Island, which they called Pearl Harbor's Sentry. Again, American intelligence gained knowledge of the plan. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Ocean Zone, deployed all 3 of his carriers, including Coral Sea veteran Yorktown, to cover Midway. On the 4th of June 1942, the opposing fleets clashed. The battle began with a Japanese airstrike against Midway itself. The aim of this was to destroy the American Air Force on the island. But although a number of US aircraft were destroyed, the Japanese failed to eradicate the American air threat. The Japanese commander, Admiral Chuichi Naguma, therefore ordered another attack on the island. But the Americans had located the Japanese carriers. Naguma's decision to attack Midway again meant changing over from torpedoes to bombs and rebriefing the crews. His crowded carriers were at their most vulnerable. It was now that the Americans struck. Naguma's carriers managed to repulse the first wave, shooting down most of the attackers. The Japanese now resumed their preparations for the second strike against Midway. But before they could launch their aircraft, another group of American planes was overhead. The result was devastating. Within 5 minutes, 3 out of the 4 Japanese carriers were crippled. Yet in spite of this disaster, the Japanese were by no means finished. Aircraft were now launched from the surviving carrier, Hiryu. Their target was the American carriers. It was Yorktown which faced the main weight of the attack. In spite of a determined defense, some Japanese aircraft got through. Yorktown was struck by 3 bombs, which knocked out 2 of her boilers. This was followed by 2 torpedo hits. The cumulative effect was to cripple the carrier. Not until the afternoon of the following day was the battle resumed. American aircraft attacked the Hiryu and so damaged her that she had to be scuttled. The Battle of Midway was to prove the turning point of the war in the Pacific, and the successful landings in the Aleutians were to be of little avail. Yet there was some consolation for the Japanese when, on the afternoon of the 7th of June, one of their submarines, which had been patrolling off Midway, struck the crippled Yorktown with 2 torpedoes. But it was not until the following day that the Yorktown finally sank, going down with her battle ensign flying. The Japanese were still determined to take Port Moresby, however. This time they decided to land on the northern coast of Papua New Guinea and then strike overland through the Owen Stanley Mountains along the Kokoda Trail. A small Australian force had been sent to cover the north coast and initially managed to hold the Japanese when they landed in August 1942. But after a month's tough fighting, the Japanese forced the Australians to pull back down the Kokoda Trail. It was a grim withdrawal, and many sick and wounded Australians owed their survival to dedicated Papuan porters. Reinforcements, both Australian and American, were landed at Port Moresby and slowly began to push the Japanese back. The struggle, however, was a very tough one, amid fetid jungle, tropical rains, and the razor-backed ridges of the Owen Stanleys. Malaria, too, was rife. It was not until January 1943 that the last Japanese resistance on Papua New Guinea was eradicated. But elsewhere, the Allies had also been showing aggression. In May 1942, British troops landed on Vichy French Madagascar in the Indian Ocean, fearing that the Japanese might use it as a submarine base. It was, however, to be 6 months before the French finally surrendered. Meanwhile, some American troops had been sent to Australia, and on the 2nd of July 1942, the American Joint Chiefs of Staff ordered General MacArthur to invade the Solomon Islands. He was given just 1 month to prepare. The 1st US Marine Division, which had recently landed in Australia, was selected for this operation. The Marines hastily set sail, but had to put into New Zealand in order to reorganize their stores. This gave them a little more time to carry out combat training. On the 31st of July, the Marines set sail once more for what the planners called Operation Shoestring, because of the lack of resources. Naval support had to come from Hawaii and was built around 3 carriers, the only air support available. This met with the landing force at Fiji, and the combined force then sailed on to the Solomons. Here the island of Guadalcanal had been selected as the initial objective. The Japanese had been constructing an airfield on the island, and this was to be the initial American target, so that the landing force could have early ground-based air support. At 6:15 a.m. on the 7th of August 1942, 3 cruisers and 4 destroyers opened fire on the Guadalcanal coast. 30 minutes later, the order, "Land the landing force," was given. The naval bombardment, augmented by carrier-based aircraft, continued. The Marines began to head for the shore. The bombardment rose in intensity, and the first wave landed. But the 2,200 Japanese on the island had quickly withdrawn inland. This enabled the follow-up waves to be speedily put on shore. By the end of the day, 11,000 US Marines were ashore on Guadalcanal. They began to advance towards the as-yet uncompleted airfield. This was secured on the following day, but still needed much work on it before aircraft could land. Yet the Japanese were not prepared to allow Guadalcanal to fall, and quickly landed reinforcements. These soon began to attack the Marines, and a bloody stalemate ensued. More Japanese forces were landed on the northern coasts of Guadalcanal and moved up through the jungle to the front line. Work on the airfield continued. But even the landing of the first American aircraft on Henderson Field on the 26th of August did not break the deadlock. Indeed, Japanese efforts to retake the airfield intensified. At sea, the Japanese used warships to bring in reinforcements and supplies, the system which the Americans nicknamed the Tokyo Express. There were a number of naval clashes during the hours of darkness in the waters around Guadalcanal. These demonstrated the superiority of Japanese night fighting techniques over those of the Americans, who lost several ships. There were also numerous Japanese air attacks on the ships of the Guadalcanal task force. These attacks forced the American carriers to withdraw, but not before they had sunk a Japanese carrier. The Japanese continued to land men on the island by night. These reinforcements increased the pressure on the American Marines, especially since there were no troops to spare to bolster their strength. They became increasingly exhausted, and their casualties mounted. Not until December were they relieved by 3 fresh divisions. They lost no time in mounting a major attack against the Japanese. Resistance was stiff, but continued pressure wore the Japanese down and forced them to withdraw. In early February 1943, the surviving Japanese forces on Guadalcanal were evacuated by the Tokyo Express. They had made the Americans fight bitterly for their first island foothold in the Pacific, the first of many.